Hello, welcome to my presentation, Silent Sentries, writing the British Garrison of Yokohama back into the history of the Bakumatsu and early Meiji eras. So, Silent Sentries. Between 1864 and 1875, thousands of British troops resided in a purpose-built garrison on the slopes overlooking Yokohama. Despite forming the majority of the permanent foreign community and being central to the life of the settlement and participating in many key events during their residence, the history of the garrison remains almost entirely unexamined in the English language scholarship of the era, with such accounts of the garrison barely featuring, standing silent while the ebbs and flows of trade and diplomacy swirl around them. This paper argues the influence of the British garrison has been neglected within accounts of the period and seeks to foreground some of the areas where such influences were most marked, and in doing so seeks to restore the prominence of the voice of the garrison. So, without blowing my own trumpet too much, off we go. So, the historiography of this period, again, Japanese accounts, there's several. The best of which, regarded by many, is somewhat dated, 1957. Several more works produced in the 90s connected to the Yokohama Archives of History, one of which is a sort of edited book, another more of a study guide looking at some of the documents available. There's also another book produced 2011 by Ishizuka, based largely on his chapter in the 1999 volume produced by the Yokohama Archives of History. All of these, particularly Ishizuka's work, have certain weaknesses, so often not a lot of attention paid to foreign language, as in non-Japanese language source material. Again, some inconsistencies, some inaccuracies also about numbers of the garrison, composition, etc., units involved. Things aren't too much better on the Japanese language side, sorry, the non-Japanese language side. There's no dedicated works that exist in English on this subject. Scholarship by Cortazzi, Hoare, etc. deals with the treaty ports in general or other aspects of that. Again, work by Gordon Daniels looks at Harry Parkes' career, his involvement, but it doesn't really deal directly, of course, with the garrison itself. Very much a peripheral issue as these accounts are concerned. Again, others, Oslin looks at the negotiations between the shogunate and the Meiji government and the British side, and again, other sides. Doesn't really also look at the garrison itself. Again, uses one particular source very heavily in terms of primary material. There is some French language and French attention towards their military forces, but more on the military missions to Japan rather than the garrison or their element of the garrison. Of course, there's French troops present as well. So, historiography more broadly, again, no works really deal with the force in its entirety all the way through from its arrival through its departure into its legacies, etc. Again, you could argue various reasons for this neglect. The diplomatic and economic history is very heavily focused upon. The garrison is seen, if it's seen at all, or heard at all, I suppose, is more of a sort of functionary or background. It's not really considered to be important. As we will see, the passive influence of its presence is actually very important. So it being in the background isn't necessarily a reason to argue it's not important. The military and even diplomatic subjects somewhat, you might argue, unfashionable these days in Japan studies, some elements of Japanese history. Again, obscurity and accessibility of sources, both in language terms, but also in terms of the material. And again, this is principally a British military social history, you might argue. So it might fall between stools to an extent. So importance, in terms of historiographical trends, there's similar works coming through these days. So Fletcher talking about the Richardson or Namamugi incident, not dealing with the garrison directly. There's also a degree of dovetailing of this subject with other scholarship on non-literate, non-elites within empire and imperial soldiering. Also things to do with cultural influences of empire, imperial boredom as well, Auerbach's work, of course. And again, scholarship of technology or knowledge transfer, so things like military normative transfer, again, practices, etc. So for the remainder of my time, I'll talk about some of the notable influences and events. I won't mention and go into kind of granular detail of the involvement of the force, the garrison, in major notable events such as the Richardson murder, the Baldwin and Byrd murders, etc. But I will give an overview of some of the other significant points in its history. So timeline here, obviously I don't have any time to talk through this, but you see a kind of shifting and moving of different units in and out of Japan, both British and of course French here. Again, we have Royal Norfolk Regiment, of course, connected to our host UEA here too, present for, well, around 2 years inside the garrison, forming most of it for its presence. So action. The force is used actively, if we want to use that term, in the Shimonoseki campaign, the second or final element of that. Again, it's also involved in the Kobe incident, 1868. Also is used to protect Harry Parks when he's attacked several points. Also employed like fortifying the port of Yokohama and also Kobe during the Kobe incident. So it does have some active military usage, if we want to use that term. So, next slide. Again, size and economic influence. One of the principal ways we could say this force is important is that it makes up the majority of the population. If you have a look at this grey chart down the bottom, again taken from Yokohama Archives of History publication 1993. Again, the grey bars indicate the kind of population size of the troops, and the white bars indicate the population size of the permanent, if we want to use that term, foreign population. So you can see for most of the years, arguably up to 1872, all of them in fact, the population is larger than that of traders, diplomats and others. Again, of course, the garrison, as I'm arguing, doesn't get anywhere near the attention, or virtually no attention, as it were, as compared to traders, diplomats, etc. Again, the size and economic influence is also, well, particularly economic influence is there in terms of provision of security. So one of the key accounts from the period by Black talks about how after the arrival of the troops, it brings a sort of sense of tranquility and peace, and again allows a solid foundation upon which commerce can grow after their arrival. Again, their size is important, but it's magnified also in terms of economic influence through a favorable exchange rate military forces are granted by the shogunate. So the Ichibu exchange means that they can exchange their wages or elements of their wages a way which generates a profit. And this is used by the military units or the soldiers themselves to drive demand. Of course, they purchase goods, services, various other things inside the port, as does, of course, purchasing supplies for the force. So very important population, sizable population, the biggest, but also one which has an economic heft greater than its actual size. Again, ledger and cultural influences. I don't have anywhere near enough time to go through these in very fine detail, but a lot of the time the garrison is spent training, drilling, what have you. A lot of the rest of its time is spent in kind of cultural activities or exercise, I suppose you might say. Again, these things, so sports, etc., have been long recognized as central to the life of the treaty port, the social elements, the social sphere, the social history of the treaty port. But the centrality of the garrison within them hasn't. So things like horse racing, the kind of sporting events, lots of the competitors are just soldiers or Marines. Again, the officials are all soldiers or Marines. Certain things which are set up for them or by them, again, become more generally used later on. So horse racing, some of the shooting ranges, etc. Again, big influence of things like music. They're often employed to provide that as entertainment. Again, there's obviously the relatively famous case of the bandmaster Fenton being involved in the writing of the Japanese national anthem, hired by the government after allegedly some Japanese officials hearing his work. Again, the establishment of Western style theatre also owes a lot to the presence of these troops inside the country. So we can also look at British strategy or policy. The garrison forms a key tool or maybe weapon inside the British legations armory. Again, ideas of having a kind of presence, strategic presence or military presence in the region have been talked about for a long time, but it's not really the focus by any means of British policy to do this. Again, the fact that people like Parkes and others think that, or take cultural cues or miscues maybe from his dealings with China, and view the usage of military force or the potential to use that as essential when dealing with the Japanese, again reinforces the case for this and reinforces the value it's seen as having by British ministers. Again, the necessity of retaining troops in the region is also a key point here. So ongoing unrest and violence in China. And also Japan has its advantages. It's seen as Yokohama in particular, a healthier place to station the troops as opposed to Hong Kong or other parts of China. There's also a kind of passive value, which I've already alluded to, I think, earlier on. So the troops are there to protect the settlement and trade, of course, from domestic threats or threats from inside Japan. Again, though, it also has a value versus the imperial rivals of Britain. So deter French, Russian intervention or action inside Japan, or give them a base from which to respond to such if it were to occur. Again, prestige and trade concerns are also heavily involved here. Some argue the reason that it takes so long to withdraw the troops is to do with issues of prestige or diplomatic standing vis-a-vis France, who also has its garrison there. Neither wants to withdraw before the other does. Again, a bargaining chip later on, so these forces can be used in negotiations with the Meiji government over concessions in return for removing him, for example. Okay, so we can talk again about sovereignty. The presence of the troops again could be argued as illustrative of changing conceptions of sovereignty or international law on the Japanese side. Again, learning about or being socialized into Western systems and adapting to them, often under duress. So the arrival of the troops is approved of after the fact, tacitly by the shogunate, and you could argue that it's relatively nonplussed about the situation. It doesn't really mind. It's not a modern state, of course. It doesn't have a monopoly on military force, and it's glad of the help to protect the settlement. Again, useful for protecting against a potentially embarrassing or potentially catastrophic attack by elements inside Japanese society who oppose the presence of foreigners, for example. Again, it's also, of course, not in the position to say no easily without triggering conflict or some further escalation of the numerous problems it's having with the outside world at this point. For others, though, again, lots of foreign, accounts and others view that the shogunate isn't actually able to protect them properly, and it's failing in its duty to do so, so they need these forces to protect them. Into the Meiji era, as Japan's international experience increases and more is learned about the way diplomacy is conducted in the West, the presence of the troops takes on a more conventional meaning. So it's seen as a symbol of inequality, of compromised sovereignty, etc. So security, again, I've already talked about the passive and active roles, the deterrent factor you could argue these troops represent. So against the so-called terrorism, as Ossanen and others call it, of anti-foreign attacks. Again, provision of such provides security, stability, some things which are not in particularly strong effect, you might argue, in Japan at this point. Again, the force itself provides internal security or police matters, or acts as the police force inside the settlement. Again, another element which hasn't really been examined at all before. So the legacies, of course, there's the cultural legacies, strongly felt, the establishment or the first playing of lots of these sports which persist in Japan to this day, the anthem, for example, again, the musical side. There's also contributions directly and indirectly to other trends. So you might say that military power being seen as a base indicator of modernity and security on the Japanese side could be linked to later militarism. And again, one influence on that is the presence of these foreign troops inside of its territory during this point. Again, one of the things which these troops do is train some shogunate forces. Again, the influence of that, or the lasting influence of that, is disputed or debated. So whether the French military missions or other military missions later have a greater influence is, of course, relatively easy to argue. Again, how much legacy there is from the British presidency is something which I hope to examine in more detail. So, particularly the influence of Shimonoseki here, again, the usage of the infantry, while the Marines actually in this point, during that campaign arguably indicates to Choshu that modernization is necessary if you want to confront the West or deal with the West even in an equal way. So the troops themselves also, they contribute to kind of changing internal political dynamics inside the country. Finally, the arrival and, more importantly, maybe departure represent key stages in the compromising and steps towards the eventual recovery of sovereignty by Japan, or the Meiji state. After they leave, there's no more foreign troops garrisoned in Japan until 1945, where again, interestingly, they arrive in Yokohama first under the, of course, Allied occupation forces. If we go back, multiple influences, usually underplayed or abstracted from the garrison in the extant scholarship. Again, worthy of attention, again, akin to that of the merchant community. So taking into account the size of the force and its influence, and again, the kind of violent, unstable situation that existed, particularly in the early years of the treaty port, you could argue that it may be more accurate to look at that port as a tense, occasionally violent military cantonment rather than the flourishing cosmopolitan pageant of trade and cultural interaction that lots of accounts paint it as. Certainly becomes something more akin to that, but the early phase is very much militarized. Although, of course, the force is used very rarely, its presence has a passive or indirect influence, such as arguably deterring aggression, promoting a sense of security and influencing affairs, as I've already mentioned, inside of Japan. So, of course, the voice has an influence, or has volume, if we would like to say it like that here, but the silence of the forces, or silence of the garrison here, is notable in itself. So perhaps this indicates its strength, that it influenced matters without needing much usage, and whilst providing a lot of the background to the social life of the port, again, other elements forming, of course, most of the population at certain stages, and of course providing the security that helps sustain and stabilize it, the garrison gave space through this silent protection, as it were, to the diplomats and traders and others who, of course, received more attention to practice their professions in peace. So thank you very much. Again, all the images used here are public domain. If you want to see the bibliography and sources, feel free to get in touch. Again, more information on this project, this element of it, and again, the rest of my scholarship and studies are available through my Academic Edu page. So thank you very much.